I think one of the most obvious parts of human life is conversation. Two or more people get together and they converse, they communicate back and forth, back and forth. I, like many others, wonder if in this day and age, conversation is becoming a dying art. Maybe, like me, you've been to the shopping mall and you'll see a bunch of teenagers sitting around and no one's looking at anyone else. They're down at their phone and they're sending each other text messages. But I suppose even that is a kind of conversation. They're sending messages back and forth, back and forth. In many ways, an important or key theme in the Christian faith is the idea that human life is a conversation between God, or rather a conversation between God and humankind, a conversation between the Creator and those of us who have been created. After all, God made the universe, and then God made humankind, and then God has reached out to humans. God has made promises of relationship and faithfulness to humankind, and God's people are those who have put their hope in those promises. Sometimes the human conversation with God is a difficult one. Many of you will be familiar with the story of Job from the Bible. Job was a person of God, the most faithful person in the world. And then everything was taken away from Job, his family and his possessions, and he had a difficult conversation with God, an angry conversation with God. He complained to God, said he wasn't very happy with how God was running the world or running his life. And if you remember, God answered, Job, where were you when I created the world? There are lots of difficult conversations between God and humans, even in the Bible. Some of you have had difficult conversations with God. And I want you to know that if you're upset with God, or if you have something that you want to say to God, even if you don't think it's very nice, you can say it. Sometimes the conversations with God are happier ones. Psalm 33 that Joyce read so well for us is a happy conversation with God. God has created humans. God has reached out to us with promise. God's people have responded with hope in God's promises. And then, as the psalm writer expresses, God looks upon those who put their hope in Him, and He saves them. God looks upon those who put their hope and trust in Him. It's not that we want things. It's not that we choose something that we want and simply put our hope that God will provide it, but that there is an intrinsic benefit to us for putting our hope in God. For hope is perhaps the primary way that we express our desire for relationship with God. And so hope is the means by which we sustain our conversation with God back and forth, back and forth. On a hot summer day like this, I'm reminded about the first summer job I had, or maybe not the first thing I ever did for money in the summer, but sort of the first real job I had when I was a young guy. It was at White Rose. You remember the home and garden centers? One spring and summer, I started working at White Rose, and it turned into be a really great job for me. I kept it for a number of years, even when I went through university. And I'll never forget, I started on my first day doing the job that no one else wanted to do. I was out in the hot sun lugging the bags of soil and manure and fertilizer into people's cars. And I did that for the first few weeks that I worked at the store. And then over time, they would give me better and better tasks. And eventually, I even got a promotion, and then another promotion at the store. And I was fortunate because some guys in my position had worked there a little bit longer than I had, but they gave me more and more tasks, eventually to the point where I was the one who managed the inventory of the garden center, and I would sell the plants and the bushes and order in new stock as our in-store stock was depleted. And I had even supervision of some of the other employees. I got to tell those newer guys who were lugging the dirt and the fertilizer, I got to tell them what to do. And the reason I was so lucky to get promoted in those small ways is because I worked hard and I had an interest and I was trying to do my best. And because some of the other guys were less hardworking and less interested, they would tap me on the shoulder. You see, an employer looks upon those who work hard and are motivated and have an interest to learn and to grow. Those are the employees that an employer looks upon. God looks especially upon those who put their hope in Him, for they are the ones who have expressed an interest in relationship and conversation with God. Now, putting our hope in God doesn't mean that we will get to achieve success in whatever way we or others might choose to define it, but rather putting our hope in God is the best way to go through life, both in good times and in bad, because that is how we ensure our continuing conversation with God. The psalm writer goes on to express this wonderful thought: we rejoice because we have trusted in God. The psalm writer was giving voice to that joy which is known in the moments when we realize putting our trust in God was the right thing to do. That moment of deep satisfaction and happiness which comes from the recognition that walking down the path God has laid before us, even when we were not sure exactly where it led or how it would get to our destination, was the right thing to do. When I was much younger and still lived at home with my family, I remember we used to watch this TV program. It was a British show. And after many seasons of episodes, two of the main characters finally fell in love. And for them, it was a moment of great joy, realizing that for the years they had known each other, and for the time they had spent together as friends, that it was finally coming together in romance. It was a moment of great joy to realize that the wait had been worth it. I'm sure I've told before the story of a young woman who was blind and had just received a new seeing eye dog. She was out one day on some errands, being led by her guide dog, when all of a sudden she began to encounter all kinds of resistance in her path. It began to take a great deal of strength and perseverance to keep up with the dog, to follow in the path that was being set. And she was even getting some minor scrapes and bruises along the way, and she was getting quite frustrated with the animal. And then when that period of difficulty and resistance came to an end, she was scolding the dog. And then an observer came up and mentioned to her that what had happened was the dog had led her through a hedge. And the reason the dog had led her through the hedge was to help her get around a parking lot that was full of broken glass. Sometimes following in the path that God has set for us is difficult. And sometimes as we walk along that path, it is so difficult we are not sure if in fact we are on the path that God has set. We begin to wonder if we have wandered away. In that moment when we realize that our trust was well placed, that where we walked was in fact where God had led us, that where we are is in fact the destination God has chosen for us, and that not only is God with us at the destination, but that God has been with us all along the way. It is a moment of deep joy. The psalm writer concludes the poem, of which we heard a portion, with a prayer to God, where it says, "Let your loving kindness be upon us as we continue to hope." One of the difficult things about reading the Psalms is how the writers sometimes switch from one voice to another. Sometimes the poem will be in first person, and then it will switch to third person, and then back to second person. And we've seen that switch in Psalm 33. We've had first person expressing the experience of the writer, and then we've had third person, a statement about God, and then we conclude with a prayer in the second person, an address to God. God, let your loving kindness continue to be upon us as we hope. I think it's true to say that in life we are rarely, if ever, at our destination. We are almost always, if not at all times, on a journey. And so while we may have those moments of joy when we realize that God has brought us to a certain place, there is usually another leg to the journey, and then another and another after that. And as people of God, we are at not only the point of being thankful that God has brought us this far, but continuing to hope and pray that God will be with us and will continue to guide us on that next leg. A few years ago, I think I may have been in university, I made the mistake of giving some money to a political party that I supported at the time. And I could not believe how persistent they were in keeping in contact with me. Even though I had given just a small amount on that one time, they phoned me for years and years. And I think the only way I managed to escape was to move out of my parents' house. Although, if you can believe it or not, I still get the emails. Sometimes there are conversations we want to get out of. Our conversation with God is one that we want to stay in. For it is the thing that will sustain our relationship with God not only today but tomorrow. It is the thing which will keep us going and reassured that whatever our next step is, God is with us, and we can continue to put our hope and trust in God. In many ways, our lives are best seen as a conversation with God. The 33rd Psalm is one beautiful way that that conversation is expressed. God, our Maker, has reached out to us. God has made promises of faithfulness. God's people are those who have put their hope in the very promises of God. God continues to look with favor upon those who have put their hope in Him. God's people are those who rejoice because they have trusted and they have realized that their hope was well placed. God's people are generally those who continue to pray to God, let your loving kindness continue to be upon us as we go. This past March at the Academy Awards, the Oscars, there was a film that won the Oscar in the category of Best Documentary. It was called 20 Feet from Stardom. And it was a documentary about those backup singers who sang the chorus lines and the backup for famous crooners like Frank Sinatra and others. And while these backup singers were so much of the reason for the beautiful sound, they remained anonymous, while the star up front received the fame and the fortune. Now, many of these backup singers were women, and many of them were those who learned to sing growing up in church. And when 20 Feet from Stardom was announced as the winner of the Best Documentary, a group came up to receive the award, and the woman who represented all of the singers whose stories had been told was Darlene Love. And she began her acceptance speech. It was very brief, with an expression of praise to God. And then simultaneously, she broke into a rendition of one of the most well-known gospel hymns. She said, or sang, "I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He's watching me." Today we have the bittersweet occasion of bidding farewell to David Rowe and to Mina. And we have been so blessed over the last 2 years to enjoy their friendship and in particular David's musical gifts. We wish them well, and we pray and hope that they will continue their conversation with God, for we know that God will be with them as they pack up the rest of their things, as they move to Nova Scotia, and wherever they end up, we know that God will be with them. His eye is on the sparrow, and we know He's watching them. Amen.